Thank you for joining this session on upholding children's rights in schools. My name is Sifan Zawad. I'm a member of the Rights-Centric Education Network. And today, January 24th, is the International Day of Education. And this is the statement from Farida Shahid, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, to commemorate it. And in it, she talks about how young people emphasize that their voices are routinely excluded in decisions on their education. And I thought to put this up at the start because what I'm going to talk about now is going to address why it's excluded and offer a way forward. So I'm going to start with, before getting into child rights, why are human rights important? And this might be a little bit preaching to the choir, because if you're in this session, you probably already agree that human rights are important. But we live in a world where many people are largely unconcerned about human rights. Until a few years ago, I was one of them. Thanks to Richard's efforts is why I got interested and involved in it. And then we also have people who are outright hostile towards human rights. So the way I'm going to try to bring out this importance is that at every level of human society, we have agreements about how we interact and what we do if those agreements are violated. So these agreements might be in the form of norms, values, rituals, all the way to actual laws. And when we say every level, this could be like really small, like families, and then going bigger and bigger and bigger, countries, and then even between countries. So for these different types of grouping and for different contexts, we have evolved different kinds of agreements. And one way we can analyze those agreements is how power is distributed in them. So on one end, we have the like totalitarian, authoritarian kind of distribution, and at the other end, it's participatory. Or we could be more hierarchical or egalitarian, or it could be more exploitative, or it could be more equitable or dignity based. So I will call these as power over or power with. And just to make this a little bit relatable, I will give examples of some structures that are built around power over, slavery, colonization, and patriarchy. So in this power distribution spectrum, there are obviously going to be some people who want to shift more towards the power over because they are the ones who benefit from being able to exploit the people that they have power over. So the kind of slavers wanted slavery to continue, colonizers wanted colonization to continue, and there were other people who benefited from that who also wanted it. So what counters this? What can shift society to be more power with? And about 80 years ago, after a catastrophic period in which power became extremely concentrated and brutally abused, the world attempted something unprecedented. An international agreement to limit power over. And this is international human rights law. It was born, as I see it, as an effort to move societies towards more participatory, equitable, and dignity-based forms of power, the power with. Now, this was and still is an experiment. It's a work in progress. Sometimes things improve, and sometimes, especially as it seems in recent years, things get worse. And in my view, a key reason that this experiment has not worked as well as it could have is that we have not done enough to educate people about the importance of human rights. Even though that was recognized from the very beginning. So in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, it said that education shall be directed to the strengthening of respect for human rights. And I don't think this has actually happened. So without human rights, we will have societies that are not equitable, not based on dignity, and without the education, we can't get there. And then going into child rights on the importance of it. On one side, supporting human rights means supporting all human rights for all people in all circumstances. So the moment you stand only for some rights or for some people or in some circumstances, it doesn't work because it undermines the foundation of human rights, as in the preamble of the UDHR, where it says that equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, peace. Um, so when child rights are part of when children are part of the human family, then child rights will be important. A second reason why child rights are important is that the Convention of the Rights of the Child is the most widely ratified human rights treaty in the world. And in this experiment that we call human rights law, the way it works is as various attempts are made to make human rights work, we realize there are gaps. And when we find a gap, then some effort is made to address it or to patch it. So even though the UDHR explicitly refers to men and women, at some point there was a recognition that women's rights need greater protection. So in 1979, we had the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Likewise, although the UDHR doesn't say that rights are only for adults, and actually Article 1 says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, there was a recognition that children's rights needs to be made explicit and protected by law. And so we had the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. And as the most widely ratified human rights treaty, we can't just ignore it, right? And the third reason is something that I consider something of a strategic imperative. Because unless children have lived experience of what it feels like when their own human rights are upheld, we cannot, in good conscience, expect them to suddenly care about others' human rights and democracy when they become adults. And this is, I think, the part where, despite Article 26.2 of the UDHR, that experiment wasn't supported well enough by education. And talking of children's rights in general, we have to think about children's rights in schools because schools are often a child's first sustained experience of institutional power. And it's an experience that almost every child will have. So if we want children to genuinely learn about human rights, to understand them as something real and lived and not just some abstract thing that you memorize for a test, then we have to ensure that schools themselves are right-respecting institutions. And this has also been clearly recognized within the human rights framework when the World Program for Human Rights Education said that it is essential to ensure that educational objectives, practices, and the organization of the schools are consistent with human rights, values, and principles. Now, I think this is maybe a good time to look into some examples of the ways in which the presently mainstream system of schools is not respectful of children's rights. And this also has been recognized because the General Comment 1 on the Convention of the Rights of the Child in 2001 had to assert that children do not lose their human rights by virtue of passing through the school gates. And I think this is a really strong indictment on the situation of children's rights in schools that they had to make such a strong statement. So let me get into some examples of how, in my opinion, the school system is not respectful of child rights because it doesn't work to just sort of superimpose human rights education into a system that was developed before even adults, never mind children, had protection for their human rights. And this is also formally recognized in one of the general comments. So let's dive into some examples. So freedom from all forms of violence, Article 19. So corporal punishment is still permitted in schools in 62 countries, including Sri Lanka. It's prevalent in many countries that have prohibited it, like, for example, Nepal. And I would sort of imagine that going back to that superimposing example, that if and when Sri Lanka puts child rights into the curriculum of schools, which is something they've been talking about for some years now, but hasn't yet happened. But I think when they do it, it's probably going to be that if a child can't recite from memory that Article 19 is the freedom from all forms of violence, they are going to receive corporal punishment. Because unless you change the structure of the school, there's no point just putting it into the curriculum. Then Article 24 is the highest attainable standard of health, and many school systems have restrictions on when you can use toilets. And as a consequence of that, sometimes children don't drink as much water as they should because they're worried that they might have to go to the toilet and then they can't go. So this has health consequences. Then on the mental health side, there's stress and performance anxiety because of having to do well on high-stake exams. If you go to Article 15, the freedom of association, children don't have a say in who they're grouped with or which adults they are working with. So they are usually put into age-based grouping. Sometimes there's also tracking in terms of grouping by their performance. You have the better students in one class and the not so good students in another class. Freedom of expression, this is a bit of a awkwardly named one because it's not only about freedom of speech as such in saying what you want to say, but it's also about the freedom to seek and receive information without frontiers. So if you have a curriculum that is not flexible, then you don't have the opportunity to learn about the things you care about because you're limited by what's happening in the curriculum. And a few days before at this festival, Rihanna spoke about his proposal where 20% of the curriculum is decided by children, and this would be a way to allow children to exercise the right to freedom of expression. And as we saw at the start in the special rapporteur statement, children don't have the opportunity to participate in decisions on governance, curricula, teaching methods, assessment, so many things, all of which don't respect their right to be heard. So we could go on and on, having a really large list of examples of areas where it's violated, but I think we can pause on that part for now and just move on to a question of, is all of this actually just possible? Because whenever I talk about these examples, what I hear is that you can't run a school in a way that respects these rights. And I think what they're really saying is that it's not possible to respect these rights in a school built on power over, because the intention of human rights was to dismantle power over, but the system of schooling that we have in the mainstream was designed to be power over. So you really have to rethink the fundamentals of how that school is organized if you want to make it compatible with human rights. And it's also not possible unless we take child rights seriously, which is also formally there, that it can't work unless the teachers and educators are convinced of the importance of child rights. I think in many cases, children are not taken seriously. They are not seen as complete human beings who are capable of exercising and defending their own rights, but rather as human becomings who need protection. And it's the same kind of paternalistic logic that was used to justify slavery, colonization, and the patriarchy. The idea that enslaved peoples can't think for themselves, or colonized peoples can't think for themselves. So that kind of paternalism, we have tackled it somewhat in those areas, examples I mentioned, but when it comes to childism, to thinking of children as being inferior, as not worthy of the full spectrum of human rights, I think the world needs to still do a lot more. And so I know, and many people on this call also know of schools that operate on power width. There is, I think it's on the 30th a session coming up where there's a documentary about a school like that. So in these schools, children don't have corporal punishment. Sometimes there's no punishment at all because they use restorative practices. Children participate in making the rules and shaping the curriculum, deciding how they assess, when to learn, when to rest, when to play, who they work with. It's not a fantasy, it's possible. The question is, how do we make this mainstream when the mainstream is not built on foundations that really support it? So when it comes to addressing the gap or trying to, the first phase of the World Program for Human Rights Education had an approach where it called for rights-based schools, where human rights are identified explicitly and distinctively for everybody as learning objectives and as the school philosophy. Unfortunately, like what happens to many good things that come out of the human rights system, nothing much happened. I'm not aware of any state that implemented this nationally. There is a UNICEF program in some countries, but it's not done by the state who's the duty bearer who has actually the obligation to do it. And I don't even know of anybody who had a serious effort to do it. And I think the main reason there is that children's rights are not taken seriously enough. So how do we cut this Gordian knot? Because if the state doesn't take children's rights seriously or human rights education seriously, how can we have schools that uh, have human rights not only as theory but as a lived experience into schools? Because the people in charge of it don't seem to want to do this. And how can we empower rights holders, the children, to defend their own rights when they don't receive education on what their rights are? Like, how do you get into this? Do we just keep on issuing statements and declarations and things and hope that states will get around to doing something? Um, Given that it's 36 years since the CRC came into being, and still there are 62 countries that haven't abolished corporal punishment. How long is it going to take for the states to get serious about children's right to be heard? So this is where the Rights-Centric Education Quality Assurance System comes in, because the World Program also had a proposal to establish a rights-based quality assurance system where there would be some kind of assessment of how well schools respect human rights. So this would be human rights for everybody involved, but as the RCE, we are mainly concerned about children's rights because other stakeholders have other avenues to get their rights addressed. And this too was not really followed up in the 20 years since this was approved by the UN General Assembly. But we, as the Rights-Centric Education Network, initiated it. So we launched this on 20th November last year. We are presently working out the operational details of how it's going to work, which I'll not go into details on this call on. But one thing I want to say about it is it's not a top-down approach where some external authority will come and assess the school or whatever education institution and give a grade on how well they do in terms of human rights, but rather it's a bottom-up system where any school, a bottom-up system where any school or any other educational environment reports on what they are doing to advance child rights in their context. So this could be things like how they establish student unions to support children's freedom of association and expression, or what steps they have taken to abolish corporal punishment, or what steps they have taken to get student input on schedules. There's just so many things that could be done, but anything anybody is doing or plans to do, they can report. And then others, this could be children, parents, educators, can look at these reports and say, oh, we want this too. And especially for local changes like a student union, which doesn't need to be done at a national level, any of those smaller things can be done there. And we know already from our own experience as well as what was there in the special rapporteur statement for today, that children want to be involved in decisions about their education. And rather than just saying, we want this, so what about this? It's a lot easier for them to suggest improvements when they can see success stories, when they can say, oh, this school is doing this. This is how they got around to doing it. We would like to do it too. And it's also a really powerful way to learn about rights, because if you can see that, oh, the reason this school has a student union is because there is such a thing as freedom of association. And then if they have it, I should have it. What does this right really mean? And I think just in terms of that peer-to-peer kind of learning, and also because it's something that allows them to do something they want to do. If it's not going to support them in an area that they want to do, they're not going to bother about it. So it's a good way to learn about rights as opposed to studying it for an exam or something like that. So sorry about that. So the hope is that as we record more and more success stories, then more and more children will be empowered to stand up for their rights, and eventually come to a situation where the states can't afford to ignore this anymore, and there will be more pressure to take children's rights seriously, and schools and other environments can become more and more respectful of children's rights. So, yeah, states will have to listen. To conclude this is an open invitation to join the quality assurance system. It's free for anybody to participate. You can sign up at our website, and there are some sessions coming up at this festival from others in the education network, which if you go to our website /LPF 2026, it will redirect to the Learning Planet website where the other sessions will be listed. And yes, so that's what I wanted to share. And now we can go into any questions or discussions.